When I moved to Meadowbrook Hills 3 years ago, I thought I'd found the perfect suburban paradise. Manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and a homeowners association that promised to maintain property values through reasonable community standards. What I didn't anticipate was Karen Pemberton, our self-appointed H.O.A. president, who treated the neighborhood Facebook group like her personal kingdom. Karen had been H.O.A. president for 8 years running, elected by default since no one else wanted the thankless job. She ran the Meadowbrook Hills homeowners Facebook group with an iron fist, posting daily reminders about trash can positioning, lawn height regulations, and her personal interpretations of our community guidelines. Her profile picture showed her standing triumphantly beside a perfectly symmetrical garden gnome collection, arms crossed in what she probably thought was an authoritative pose. The trouble started innocently enough. I posted a simple question in the group asking about the process for installing a small solar panel array on my roof. As someone who'd spent 15 years in renewable energy consulting before semi-retiring, I knew the technical requirements and legal protections for solar installations. I just wanted to follow proper H.O.A. notification procedures. Karen's response came within minutes. Solar panels are an eyesore that will destroy our community's aesthetic appeal. They're not explicitly approved in our guidelines, so they're forbidden. Request denied. She followed this with 3 crying laughing emojis and a gif of someone shaking their finger. I replied politely, citing state laws that prevent H.O.A.s from unreasonably restricting solar installations. I even offered to use panels that matched my roof color and provided detailed architectural drawings showing minimal visual impact from street level. Karen's next post was a masterpiece of petty tyranny. Some people think they can waltz into our community and change our rules because they have fancy degrees and think they know better than residents who've lived here for decades. The H.O.A. board has spoken. No solar panels. Period. End of discussion. Moving on. She then changed the group settings so all posts required administrator approval, effectively silencing anyone who might disagree with her pronouncements. When longtime resident Bob Martinez tried to support my position by mentioning his own interest in solar energy, Karen rejected his post and sent him a private message warning about troublemakers who want to turn our beautiful neighborhood into an industrial wasteland. Over the following weeks, Karen's behavior escalated beyond the solar panel issue. She began stalking my daily activities with increasing intensity. If I parked my Tesla in my driveway instead of the garage, she'd post photos with captions like, "Some residents think parking rules don't apply to them just because they drive expensive cars." When I had landscapers trim my hedges, she appeared with a measuring tape to ensure we hadn't exceeded the permitted height reduction by more than 2 inches. The breaking point came when my daughter visited for a weekend with her college friends. They were quiet, respectful young adults who spent most of their time inside studying for final exams. Karen still managed to file noise complaints, alleging raucous parties disrupting the peace and quiet our seniors deserve. She posted a lengthy Facebook rant about entitled parents who let their adult children treat our community like a college dormitory, complete with blurry nighttime photos she'd taken while lurking behind her curtains. When I calmly explained in the group that my daughter and her friends had been studying, Karen exploded. "Don't you dare gaslight this community. I have documentation of the noise violations. Just because you have money doesn't mean you can buy your way out of following our rules." The H.O.A. board stands united against troublemakers who think they're above community standards. That's when I realized Karen had fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. My background wasn't just in renewable energy consulting. I'd spent a decade as a senior partner at one of the state's largest environmental law firms before transitioning to consulting work. My Rolodex included judges, city planners, state legislators, and environmental regulators. My expensive car wasn't a luxury purchase, it was practical transportation for someone who still consulted on renewable energy projects across 3 states. But more importantly, Karen had made a critical error in her research. She'd been so focused on harassing me that she'd failed to investigate my actual background or consider why someone might semi-retire at 45 to a suburban community while maintaining multiple professional licenses and consulting relationships. I decided to give Karen exactly what she'd been demanding: community compliance through proper channels and documentation. First, I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding the H.O.A.'s illegal restriction of solar installations. Since I'd documented Karen's explicit refusal and her stated reasons, this was a straightforward violation of state renewable energy access laws. The penalty for H.O.A. violations started at $5,000 per incident, plus legal fees. While that complaint worked through official channels, I began Phase 2. As someone with extensive experience in municipal planning law, I knew that Meadowbrook Hills had been built on land that included several environmentally sensitive areas. Our community sat adjacent to a protected wetland, and the original development had required specific environmental compliance agreements. I requested copies of all environmental impact assessments and compliance documentation from the city planning office. What I discovered was fascinating. The development stormwater management system had been designed with very specific requirements for permeable surfaces and runoff control. Many residents had unknowingly violated these requirements over the years by adding impermeable driveways, patios, and decorative features. But here's where it got interesting. As H.O.A. president, Karen was legally responsible for ensuring community compliance with all municipal requirements, including environmental regulations. Her 8-year tenure meant she'd been personally responsible for oversight during dozens of violations. I spent 2 weeks conducting a thorough environmental compliance audit of the entire community, documenting every unpermitted driveway extension, oversized patio, and decorative hardscaping that exceeded the development's environmental requirements. I cross-referenced these violations with H.O.A. approval records and found that Karen had personally approved many of them through the architectural review process. The documentation was damning. Karen had approved hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of modifications that violated the community's environmental compliance agreements. As H.O.A. president, she was potentially liable for both the violations themselves and the penalties for failing in her oversight duties. But I wasn't finished yet. I also discovered that Karen's own property included several spectacular violations. Her elaborate garden gnome display sat on a concrete pad that exceeded permitted impermeable surface limits by almost 30%. Her decorative rock garden had been built without proper drainage considerations, creating runoff patterns that violated stormwater management requirements. Most notably, her prized rose garden featured an irrigation system that drew directly from the municipal water supply without the required backflow prevention devices. This violated both city water management ordinances and state environmental protection requirements. Armed with this documentation, I prepared a comprehensive report detailing every environmental violation in the community over the past 8 years. I cross-referenced each violation with the responsible H.O.A. board member who'd approved it, the dates of approval, and the specific environmental requirements that had been violated. Then I submitted the entire report to the State Environmental Protection Agency, the City Planning Office, and the Municipal Water Authority. I also sent copies to every insurance company that provided coverage for properties in Willowbrook Estates, since environmental violations could affect coverage terms and liability. But the masterstroke was my final submission. I filed a detailed legal brief with the county prosecutor's office documenting Karen's pattern of selective enforcement and discriminatory application of H.O.A. rules. I showed how she'd approved dozens of modifications that exceeded community guidelines while simultaneously harassing residents like myself, for minor or non-existent violations. Under state housing discrimination laws, this pattern of selective enforcement constituted illegal harassment based on protected characteristics. Since I documented her specific complaints about my expensive car, and her assumption that I thought I could, buy my way out of following rules, I had clear evidence of economic status discrimination. The legal brief also detailed how Karen's arbitrary rule interpretations and retaliatory behavior created a hostile housing environment that violated fair housing protections. Her documented pattern of surveillance, harassment, and discriminatory enforcement met the legal definition of housing discrimination based on perceived economic status. 3 weeks later, the consequences began cascading through Meadowbrook Hills like a perfectly engineered avalanche. The state attorney general's office issued a formal finding that the H.O.A. had violated renewable energy access laws. Karen was personally fined $12,000 as the responsible H.O.A. officer, plus legal fees of $18,000. The H.O.A. was required to immediately approve all reasonable solar installation requests and pay additional penalties for each day of continued noncompliance. The Environmental Protection Agency's investigation resulted in community-wide violation notices affecting 47 properties, including Karen's. Each property owner faced fines ranging from $15,000 to $30,000, depending on the severity of their violations. The total community liability exceeded $800,000. But the real devastation came from the insurance ramifications. Every homeowner's insurance company in the community received notification of the environmental violations and potential liability exposure. Policy renewals were canceled or repriced with massive premium increases to account for environmental liability risks. Property values in Meadowbrook Hills plummeted by an average of 23% as news of the environmental violations and insurance issues spread through the real estate market. The community that Karen had spent 8 years protecting was now facing financial catastrophe directly traceable to her negligent oversight and selective enforcement patterns. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal investigation into Karen's discriminatory enforcement practices. Since housing discrimination violations carried both civil and criminal penalties, Karen faced potential prosecution, substantial fines, and permanent removal from any H.O.A. leadership positions. But perhaps most satisfying was the community's reaction to learning the truth about their situation. The Meadowbrook Hills Facebook group exploded with outraged residents demanding Karen's immediate resignation and threatening personal lawsuits for her negligent oversight. Bob Martinez posted a lengthy message detailing how Karen had rejected his attempts to report drainage issues in his yard, issues that turned out to be violations she was legally required to address. Sarah Chen documented Karen's refusal to investigate her neighbor's unpermitted deck addition, an addition that was now subject to a $22,000 environmental fine. Resident after resident shared stories of Karen's arbitrary rule enforcement, her rejection of legitimate concerns, and her pattern of approving modifications for her friends while harassing others for minor issues. The woman who'd positioned herself as the community's protector was revealed as the primary architect of its destruction. The final blow came when the state H.O.A. regulatory board received a formal complaint documenting Karen's violations of fiduciary duty, discriminatory enforcement, and negligent oversight. The complaint requested her immediate removal from office and permanent prohibition from serving in any H.O.A. leadership capacity. 2 days later, I was working in my garden when I heard Karen's distinctive voice rising to a shriek across the street. She was standing in her driveway, frantically gesturing at a stack of legal documents while shouting into her phone. I could hear fragments of her conversation. "This can't be legal. They can't do this to me. I've dedicated my life to this community." She spotted me watching and stormed across the street, waving the documents like weapons. Her face was purple with rage and disbelief. You, she screamed. You did this. You destroyed everything I've worked for. Do you have any idea what you've done? I continued pruning my roses, the ones I was now legally permitted to water with my compliant irrigation system. I documented violations of environmental law and discriminatory enforcement practices. Everything I submitted was factual and properly sourced. Karen's voice reached new octaves of outrage. Factual? You've ruined property values. People are losing their homes. The community is being destroyed. I looked up from my roses and met her eyes directly. The community was already being destroyed by 8 years of negligent oversight and discriminatory enforcement. I simply documented the existing violations and requested appropriate regulatory action. She stared at me with dawning comprehension, finally understanding that this wasn't about solar panels or parking spaces or noise complaints. This was about power, accountability, and the consequences of abusing authority for personal gratification. As the full scope of what I'd accomplished sank in, Karen's expression shifted from rage to something approaching terror. She realized that her 8-year reign of petty tyranny had just been systematically dismantled by someone who understood exactly how to use the system she'd weaponized against others. Her face went pale as she finally grasped that every single consequence cascading through the community could be traced directly back to violations she'd personally approved or oversight failures during her tenure as H.O.A. president.